Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Dr. A and Dr. A with Goddess Matters, relating timeless themes to contemporary women's lived experiences. No technical difficulties today. Dr. A has a special retreat that she's hosting this week, so that was one of the reasons we decided to film in advance. But one or both of us will be in the live chat with you as this is airing live. So welcome. Please don't forget to leave a comment, chat with us in the live chat, share with like-minded folk, and subscribe to the channel. So today we have a very special conversation. A couple weeks ago, we talked about my reflections of the Mary Magdalene pilgrimage in the south of France. And this week we thought we'd talk a little bit more deeply about some of Andrea's work, her doctoral work. So we titled this episode, The Evolution of the Triple Goddess, which is, I think, a very important theme in her doctoral research. And so even though it's a doctoral research, it's not going to be so heady that you can't engage with it. So I don't want to scare you off. We're going to make it as relatable as possible. So welcome, as usual, to our Wednesday episode. Dr. A, I'm going to let you take it from there.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Annalisa. Yeah, I thought it was kind of timely with everything that we're talking about coming off of your retreat and your pilgrimage around Mary Magdalene and looking at the idea of devotion, right? And how we relate to goddess spirituality or goddess spirituality theory, or how different women engage with different goddess archetypes or metaphors, or however we want to look at it. And part of what I researched and I found to be very exciting, of course, when I was working on my dissertation, was how the idea or how the metaphor of the goddess has evolved over time, as much as we can know through archaeology, anthropology, and archaeomythology, if we think about Maria Gimbutas, and my belief that the triple goddess has evolved into now a quaternity, a four-part goddess. And that can be a little bit of a spicy conversation sometimes with women who participate in goddess spirituality. There's so many different ways to approach it. I'm not even going to name the ways that women approach it because I don't want to leave anybody out and offend anyone, but there are many, many different paths to the goddess. And so I think it's important maybe to realize initially what made me think about this and why I think it's so important. And looking at the work of Carl Jung, looking back at the work of Jane Ellen Harrison, who was one of the first women, right, to work in classical Greek studies at Oxford. I believe it was Oxford. So she in her work, she tracks the beginning of goddess mythology or goddess worship, or her interest was a lot in the Greek ritual process, right? Through early Greek, pre-Olympian, right? Very early Chthonic, that it started with the great goddess, right? And most people who are in goddess spirituality are familiar with that concept of the great goddess, the one, the unity of the principle that all life came from originally a goddess, whether you're looking at original Chthonic Greek work, or if you're looking at early Mesopotamian, or whatever it is that you're looking at, early goddess theory starts out with the goddess as a unity, that she is the mother of all life, she is the mother of creation, that the cosmos is her womb through which creation is born. And so there's that initial unity. And in her work, Jane Ellen Harrison, through the Prolegomena work, talks about how it's the great goddess started as a unity, then divided into the goddess and the chore, or the mother and the chore, which would be the daughter or the maiden or the one in self, that it went from one to two, that is split into two. And then again,
And this is in Greek mythology specifically. Yeah.
Yes, specifically in Greek mythology. This is what I used as my myth model in my dissertation work, because a lot of what Jung did, and also many of the psychologists of the early 20th century, right, looking at their work, was also based sort of in this Greek model. And of course, there's the argument that Greek culture, Greek religion, Greek politics were the basis for Western, right? So, we look at, I'm thinking, what is his name? The revisioning psychology was written.
James Hellman.
James Hillman, yes, thank you, my post-menopause brain. The work of James Hillman is rooted definitively in the Greek mythological structure. So looking at that division from the unity to the two, then she tracks it from the two to the three, right? Which is the triple goddesses, which are not necessarily how we think of Maiden, Mother, Crone, but that were goddesses that worked as triads together, right? And then from there, I am proposing or proposed in my dissertation that the goddess architecture, if you will, or archetypal architecture has now expanded into, and that this is a normal progression, right? We started with 1, we went to 2, we went to 3, we went to 4. And one of the things that Jane Ellen Harrison, says is that, and I think this is really important to remember, that the goddesses, whenever they were in whatever mythological tradition you're looking at, reflect the lives of the women, not the women reflecting the lives of the goddesses, right? So that sounds like a subtle difference, but it's not really. It's the idea that the goddesses and gods and the mythologies emerged from the psyches of the men and women who were living at that time, right? As mythological theory, right? That these stories, that these myths, that these, mythology is tales that are always true but never happened, right? Right. So looking at, these mythologies as emergent from the psyches of the women at the time. And so that the idea is that if we become locked into any particular idea of how goddesses were presented at any point in time, right, then we're not allowing the evolution of the human psyche and the evolution of the human narrative to continue, right?
Right. Well, and there's also it is interesting when we're from at our present position looking to the past, especially to a culture that's no longer living and no longer has those beliefs. Like even though the Greeks are still here, modern day Greeks, they've evolved well past their ancient Greek religion. My focus we know is in Mesopotamia, and when you start to really dive deep into the trajectory of the cultural history, you see the different, yes, the evolution of these mythic images and the stories, but also how you can have two contemporary cities, for example, that have kind of different viewpoints on the same figure. So yeah, they are really porous and multifaceted. So we like to put everything like in a very strict box to make it easily understandable and applicable to our lives. But even as we know with Christianity, it's much more complex than that. It's much more complex.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings up, something that you and I have discussed a lot is the idea of the fact that myths and mythological traditions, the figures within the myths themselves, are adopted by individuals or cultures even much later, like the rebirth of the goddess feminine movement in the 1970s and 80s, right? Are adopted, but they're also adapted. While they're being adopted, they're adapted. And there's a really tricky thing there for us as scholars, right? When we look at what's being talked about in the zeitgeist or in social media or whatever, and people asserting historical claims, right, about the mythological tradition that aren't founded in what we can actually know and say is proven from archaeological texts, from archaeological evidences, from anthropological evidences.
And can I add a little asterisk
Yeah.
in there? And I want to say too that it's also different for living cultures. Like let's say we're talking about Hinduism or indigenous people that are still carrying forward their thousands and thousands and thousands of years of belief systems. That sometimes I know I've heard them say that they have certain belief systems about their past or even within their own mythological structures that might not be provable with physical evidence way into the past, even if within their own oral history it is. So that also, right, like we can also honor that that there's a oral history that exists for people that can stand side by side with our kind of more Western models of proof and hard
Yeah,
evidence.
the living lineage, right? The living
Mhm.
lineage within the particular mythological tradition, or if we want to call it religious tradition, right?
Right.
All religions are mythologies, but not all myths are religions, right? That kind of
Yeah.
thing. But
Yep.
and that's to parse the understanding that mythology, that myth in the way that we're talking about it does not mean false or does not mean a lie, or in the contemporary culture of the use of the word myth. But yeah, I think that it's interesting to think about how we bring these mythological images forward from any particular tradition, like your really in-depth work on Inanna and your book's coming out in November, and applying it to different aspects of our lives, right? But looking at applying it in a modern sense, but based in the actual original textual evidence, right? As
Right.
opposed to you sitting at home and saying, "Oh, well, this is what the archetype of Inanna activates in me, so this must be true for everyone." Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally.
So there's a difference between those things, and maybe it matters and maybe it doesn't, right? When we think about how women approach goddess spirituality and which archetypes they're attracted to and where they need support or guidance, where they're seeking an internal connection to the divine. It at some point it's like arguing about the number of angels on the head of a pin, because it's like, if it's helping them, that's great. If it's historically misconstrued, where does that rub happen, and is it important, is it not important? I think there's a scholarly line that we walk on that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, and I think that unfortunately is often missing in the cultural zeitgeist. I think that, there are some women and men, some people out there who, will claim themselves to be a shaman or a priestess, or in either long extinct, right, or ancient traditions where they, go off for a weekend or a week or a month or whatever, and come back and say that they have this exalted position or whatever. So, everybody kind of needs to find their place, I guess. Mythological traditions, and I suppose because they do ultimately emerge from the psyche, right?
Yeah.
It's really hard to say you can do this or you can't do that. But looking at what I was interested in really looking at and saying is that if we look at some of the early theories of Jung's psychology, right, on the Great Mother and on individuation, for example. And we also look at the development of looking again at the Greek from the one to the two to the three. Right. And Maiden Mother Crone, I think I was reviewing some of my dissertation work because, I wrote it, over 15 years ago. So, I can't remember all the references perfectly. But looking at that and seeing how, at the time in ancient Greece, or even looking forward towards the Roman period, most people did not live past 45, right? And yes, Plato did write about menopause, so there were women who lived past menopause. There were individuals or families that had long lived, the great granny, or even looking into the, way forward in history into the Middle Ages of the witch or the healer or the midwife that lived at the edge of the village and was an old crone, right? But generally speaking, in culture, I mean, women did not live into the postmenopause period that as we know it, right? Now,
Mhm.
I know you and I have discussed how in ancient times, some scholars are positing that from archaeological evidence in terms of skeletal remains and those kinds of things, that women may have started their cycle sooner and so may have gone into menopause.
They started their cycles later,
Oh,
and
oh.
they actually started menopause earlier. It's the
Mm.
opposite. Yep.
I had that opposite. So that's a possibility as well. But in terms of what we understand now and what we're living as an embodied experience, right, of the perimenopause, menopause, post-menopause period of time of life for women, as I've said a million times, and I'll say a million and one, right, that, starting with boomers and all the women following behind, we're the first generations of women in the history of humanity to live past menopause together as a cohort, as generational cohorts. It it never happened before, and that change really began at the turn of the 20th century, right? As women's lifespans expanded and life got longer, healthcare, sanitation, food health, all these different things that
Right.
contributed to the lengthening of our lives.
Right. There's a few things here that I think are important. I still think that we need to talk a little bit more about the triple goddess, but let's bookmark that and kind of like where it comes from in modern times. I think that's important for people to know.
Yeah, yeah.
But also, I think, really what your work is focusing on is like, okay, so there's a biological component, which, women en masse are living longer in their years, post-menopausal years. But even if some women were doing that in the ancient past, what you don't see when you go to a museum, and I have to credit my friend Melissa for reminding me of this when she lives in Greece and I was living in Greece for a while, that you don't see a lot of depictions in the museum of women beyond motherhood years. Like, you see them as little girls and you see a lot of them, like, as mothers, maybe breastfeeding or with children. And we're not talking about images of the goddess, I'm talking about human women.
Yeah.
And so I think what we're looking at is like, what was the role and value of postmenopausal women or women beyond childbearing years in those societies? Because the whole focus was on women bearing children for the men that they were married to, because it was
Yeah.
men's children, right? And so it's a social problem. Like, what is the meaning and role and purpose of being a woman in those societies versus what you're talking about right now, right? Is that there's an expansion of what it means. So it's not just a biological length, but there's opportunities happening socially in the culture for women to,
Yeah, yeah,
you know,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole idea of that I've put forth that of the 4 stages mythologically being represented as Maiden, which is the same, the one in herself years, when you're a child and a young woman, before you menstruate, before you're responsible to anyone or anything else, before you're married, before you have children, if you go that route, before you start your career, before you have a partner, whatever it is that you dedicate yourself to that's outside of growing and knowing yourself. And from there, we go into the householder years, which I've borrowed that from the Hindu tradition because I really like that term because I think it encompasses all women and all lifestyles, whatever choices you make to have children, to not have children, cisgendered, not cisgendered, right? Whatever it is, right? And so that all women then go out and start their lives and begin their careers and their own home and whatever it is that they do. And then from there we go to Regent, which is Chris Downing made me choose dates from about 45 to 70. And then from 70 on, I use wise woman. Crone in mythological circles has always been a powerful word, has always been very accepted. But in cultural parlance, right, a lot of women don't relate to the word crone. They don't like it. They feel that it has a pejorative connotation.
negative. Yeah.
Right, right, as opposed to
But
a powerful.
so what you're really inventing really is that third archetype, the regent.
Yes.
That's really the focus of your work, as you were right, is that you were saying that most women aren't crones when they pass over the menopause rainbow bridge. They
Yeah.
still have a lot of life and vitality for them with
Right,
them.
yeah. Well, yeah, the whole thing is that, when for women now going into perimenopause and menopause, right? Usually they're like thinking about retirement or some women are wanting to start their own business or whatever that career aspect of it is. If they have children, they're heading towards or in the midst of empty nest, right? Oftentimes my clients and I talk a lot about the fact that women when they begin to go into regency, which is most women are in perimenopause by the age of 45, but that women are ready to say, okay, it's my turn. I want to do something for me. I've spent the last 20 years in my householder years, 20 to 30 years, pouring myself into everyone and everything else, right? And now that, my kids are gone, or now that I want to change careers, or now that I want to reclaim, my life for myself, right? Because there's another 20 to 30 years of active, creative life ahead of women now in postmenopause years, right? And so the women are on the takeoff trajectory. And if they are married and have children and that kind of thing, oftentimes the men are in the coming in for a landing, right? The men want to come home, right? Want to stop working, want to relax, want to whatever. I don't know what this cough is, but here it is. And so the women are ready to kind of go into something new. And these sort of the it's my turn meme, right? And part of that whole regency piece is not just the idea of it's my turn, but is the idea that of women understanding and really educating themselves that they're going to go through a very, very complex transformation during the Regency years. And it's not just menopause. I mean, menopause is having a moment right now, right? I mean,
Mm.
I'm glad for it. I'm happy for it that women can now find really great, reliable information, great treatment options, great new hormone replacement, safe hormone replacement therapies, if they choose to do that. all kinds of information on sexual health. I mean, there's been information boom, right? But at the same time, there's not a lot of talk about the midlife shift that's happening at that same time.
The
And
psychological.
psychological, yeah, it's a very real stage of human development, right? Midlife. And so it's a time of reassessment. So women in this period of regency go through a triple transformation, right? They go through the physical, they go through the psychological, which is the life stage of midlife, which is the saying, waking up in the middle of the night and saying, "Oh my gosh, I guess I really am mortal. Like someday I'm going to die, and maybe I have more years behind me than ahead of me." That can be very terrifying. Or the idea of dealing strictly with the idea of your own mortality, realizing that you don't have endless do-overs anymore because you're not 25, and if you make a mistake, you can start over, right? The thinking of, gee, I thought I'd be further ahead by now. This wasn't what I envisioned for myself. Or even the feeling of, I was so happy a week ago. What happened? Right?
Mm,
Why all of
mm,
a sudden am I so restless, so feeling
mm,
so out of sorts? And so,
right, or even, like, the bigger life shifts, right, that you talk about often, which is the emptiness syndrome. That's a very big real thing too, right? Now what's the purpose of my life now that I don't have kids that I'm caring for?
yeah, yeah, actually, absolutely. I mean, going through the psychological shift of midlife, women have to cross 7 realms of change, right? And they have to learn how to deal with these realms because you don't just go through it once. They they're on a spiral, and you keep coming back through them because once you hit regency, your life is going to be constantly about change, right?
Okay,
And
let me ask a question. So you talked about 3, and interrupted you before you got to the 3rd one. You said biological, psychological, and then there's a 3rd thing, and now you're
yes.
talking about 7 realms of change. So
Okay,
how
so let
are
me
the
go
yeah,
through it.
okay.
So the 3 major transformations is the physiological, which is the perimenopause to menopause and postmenopause, right? Then there's the psychological, which is midlife, and then those 2 aspects of living an embodied life as a woman, right, are so tightly woven in the tapestry of our lives that if you pull on one thread, it snags the other. And
Mhm.
so oftentimes what happens is when these 2, the psychological and the physical, begin to shift at the same time, it triggers what I call a spiritual shift, which is the reassessment of our purpose, meaning, and belonging
Mm.
at this time of life, right? Like if your focus, as you say, was completely on raising a family or on your children and they're gone, and then it's like, okay, well, who am I? What am I doing? What's my purpose now? Where's the meaning in my life now that I'm not doing what I was doing? And this happens to women oftentimes who are career oriented. They retire and all of a sudden they're like, ooh, who am I? What gave me meaning before is not here. Oftentimes, if a lot of your social activity was tied to your career and you retire, all of a sudden you have no social life, right? I mean, a lot of things change. So the triple shift is very different, a very different experience of midlife than what men experience. Women
Oh, it is?
have a very different embodied experience. And so within the psychological shift, right, and the physiological shift are what I call the 7 realms of change that women go through, which is your changing body, of course, right? You're changing self-image, which has to do with aging in a patriarchal culture, with how people value you or don't value you, how people perceive you or don't perceive you, how you feel about your changing body, right? All of the things that go along with that, which is the aches and pains of growing older, which are the challenges, right? Of going into regency. But at the same time, there's so many opportunities, right? So there's your changing body, your changing feelings about everything that's happening, changing needs, which as you age and as you move into a different psychological stage of life, you find that your needs change. And from after needs is roles. You're changing roles, which is a big one for a lot of women. And then is priorities and goals, because
Mm,
your priorities as you age are going to change based on all of those realms. And then your goals, again, are going to come out of whatever your priorities are. And all of these are interlinked in a Venn diagram, right?
mhm.
As women age and go through regency into their wise woman years, they may have 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 years where physically post-menopause, everything is fine. And then they get to a certain time and they're dealing with health issues or aches and pains or whatever, and the body comes right back again. The
Mm.
body, right? The body realm. And then attached to that is the self-image, and attached to that is your feelings. So all of these continue, right, to circle back around as dynamic archetypal realms within within Regency, which holds within it equal challenges, equal opportunities. And it's that tension of opposites, right?
Would you say that those 7 realms of change actually exist within all 4 of those stages of life?
Yes, certainly they are aspects that have to be dealt with, but midlife is like the crux, is like the fulcrum, where in some ways, let's use a broad brush, which we never should, but I'm going to use a broad brush, right? In some ways, right, before the midlife fulcrum, everything seems to be focused around opportunity, right? Opportunity and challenges, but if there are failures, if there are things that happen, there's more time, there's more space, right? And when you hit midlife, right, these big shifts happen in terms of how you see yourself in relation to everyone else, how everyone else sees you. And then there's the huge cultural piece for women aging in patriarchy, right?
Yeah, and the way that their symptoms are disregarded, and the way that they become invisible,
Yeah.
or they are less likely to get work, or what I'm sure there's a whole host of
Oh,
issues there.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We could spend an episode on each of the issues that women face in midlife aging and patriarchy, right? And we're all very familiar with them. What's more important, I guess, is addressing solutions than continuing to list the problems. But yeah, so for me, like when we look at a lot of things began to happen at the turn of the century around 1900, right? We have the what I call the roots of the rebirth of or the birth of the goddess spirituality movement, the return of the sacred feminine in terms of its reemergence from the collective human psyche, right?
And isn't this actually when the triple goddess came into as like a archetype, the Maiden Mother Crone archetype came in?
Maiden Mother Crone was really sort of cemented in The White Goddess, written
Mhm.
by Robert Graves, which was published, I think, in the late 1940s, I think. And that was a syncretism. His work pulled on Frazer and pulled on Murray and pulled on Harrison and so many different people. And
And he stole some of his ideas from his former lover,
oh,
Laura
yeah.
Redding.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Mhm.
so there were so many he brought so many ideas together, and you can read in one place where he says it's a poetic synchronous or syncretism of lots of ideas, and there are other places where he says, "No, it was inspired, it was channeled, it was divinely given." So even within, like, his own work, right, how you look at how he saw it, right, at the time. And so that idea really cemented in the cultural zeitgeist, the idea of Maiden Mother Crone, the idea also of the green man and the great goddess in in nature cultures, with the rise of the oak king and the holly king, and the mating with the goddess, and the death and resurrection of the king each year through that sort of birth and death cycle,
Yeah,
right?
so
We
these
talked
are
about
basically 20th century intellectual ideas based on whatever fantastical analyses of older mythological systems that weren't necessarily part of the worldview or the architecture, if we call it the mythological architecture of the original culture. Is that correct in saying?
Yeah, I would, there was so much going on at the time when Jane Ellen Harrison was researching, when James Frazer was writing The Golden Bough, and it started out as a single tome, and I think it ended up being 12 volumes, right? There was a lot of rebirth in the interest of mythology and the history of goddess worship and goddess patterning, right? In the ways of living life, in the ways of devotion, right? So
And and the possibility of a pre-patriarchal goddess worshiping past came about at this time.
yes. Yeah,
Mhm.
there, Engels and a number of other writers in the late,
Bohaven or some German dude. Mother Right, wrote Mother Right.
yeah, 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 also contributed to a number of those. I have them, they're all in here. If any, we'll put the link to my dissertation if you really want to
There you
dig
go.
into this. you can go online and download it and read it. So if you really want to see how I construct my argument, I guess the point being that this idea of Maiden Mother Crone as the triple goddess, right, really became cemented at the end, middle to the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, mid 1900s. And then we have the birth of the goddess spirituality movement, right? And all of the different aspects of that, from the craft and the Wiccan traditions all the way to other embodied ways of engaging with it, right? Through
Right.
traditional spiritual religious culture.
Right.
Were you going to say something?
Well, I just think that I think that, yeah, the distinction we're trying to make is that even though there were, like you said earlier, triple goddess functions in,
Yeah.
mythological pasts and present,
Yeah.
the Maiden Mother Crone is a modern invention, is a modern mythological invention.
Yeah.
And so, but even so, and the point is that you're broadening it, right? You're adding to it. You're saying this is
Yes.
not enough anymore.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
and so, and because it's not some kind of eternal given archetype, we can grow it and expand it and change it because it's not meeting our needs today.
Right, right. Well, and that's the whole idea, is that the goddesses reflect the lives of the women, the lives of the goddesses. And so if we had a triple model, right? I think that most women who are 50 would not necessarily say, although some might claim croneship at the age of 50. Chris Downing actually even wrote in her book on menopause that she, you know, really did not feel that claiming crone at 50 was particularly valid or reasonable.
Or helpful. And then she says somewhere that when she hit 90, she really knew what it meant to be a crone.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And she's one of the foremost living goddess
Yeah.
scholars and teachers. But
Yeah.
the idea that when we're 50 now, we have another 20 to 30 years of creative potential to interact, to create, to change the world. Women have more cultural power, more financial power, and more political power than any time in history. Now, of course,
Right.
what's going on in our government and governments around the world, they're heading more towards the right and towards fascist ideas and towards and some of them having the very what I would consider to be radical ideas of taking the vote away from women and having women go back into the kitchen and be barefoot and pregnant, and that's it. I mean, that's an outlying backlash, I guess, to the return of the sacred feminine. And so within this idea of what happened in 1900, we had the archetype of the sacred feminine reemerging, I would say, from the anima mundi, from the world soul, which includes all living beings as well as the earth itself, right? As long as Gaia as an embodied archetypal energy herself. And so in the emergence of that, we had the suffrage movement, right? Was the beginning. Women got the right to vote, right? Obviously, women's healthcare is now just starting to catch up, right? But we had all of this scholarship and all of this work through the women's goddess movement on looking back at the architecture, not the architecture, the archaeology, the all of the different aspects of these ancient cultures through the work of like Marie and other
The women historians.
historians and
Mhm.
archomythologists and, all these different things looking at and saying, okay, well, was it always patriarchy? No. So what did we have before patriarchy? Well, we had some matriarchies. We had matrilineal cultures. We had cultures that seemed, from the archaeological and anthropological evidences, to be balanced culture, right? Within them, right? The evidence that Marie Gimbutas found of matrilineal, peaceful agrarian cultures in the
Mhm.
Russian steppes, right? In the eastern steppes, and
Mhm.
then the invasion of warrior-like cultures whose god systems were transcendent god
Mhm.
systems rather than immanent god
Mhm.
systems, bringing their warrior culture, their horse traditions, their horse culture with them. And so, and now,
And their sky daddy worshiping.
yes, and their sky god worshiping. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and then we look at places like Cut Right, and we look at places where there's really great evidence that's coming forth now, where people are saying, yeah, it seems that this this was indeed a matrilineal culture where the inheritance line
Mhm.
went through the mother line, right? Where
Yeah, I
men,
was so lucky that that article came out right before my the final draft of my book went out because I was able to add it in there. It's
Yeah,
like, Maria Gimbutas is vindicated.
exactly, through DNA evidence,
Yeah, through DNA evidence.
she was vindicated. So looking at the fact that inheritance went through the mother line so that when a woman married, the man married into her family line, right? And the
Mhm.
inheritance went from mother to daughter to mother to daughter to mother to daughter. And now, of course, scientifically, when lots of evidence has come out in the past 10 to 15 years on the mitochondrial Eve and the fact that mitochondria, which is the energy system of the cell, that mitochondrial DNA is passed down again through
Through the
the
mother
female
line.
line, right?
Mhm.
And so it's just very interesting to see all of this coming together. And so the idea of the reemergence of the quest, or not the reemergence, the emergence of the quest for the reclamation of the archetypal feminine into, let's just say, the global north or Western culture. Let's just leave it there
Mhm.
for a minute because
Yeah,
we
it's
could really
complicated.
go down a rabbit hole if we went into the East, right?
Yeah.
Is, started during this period, during the 20th century, and has brought us to this point now where we realize that many of us realize that if we don't find a way to balance culture globally and to create sustainable cultures, right, which include balancing the masculine and the feminine, and these attributes that are archetypally considered feminine or attributes that are archetypally considered masculine. And, it goes without saying that every human being, whether male or female, has archetypal energies of both male and female within them, right? It's not a.
I actually don't think most people know that. I think it is worth saying. It doesn't go without saying. I think we do have to remind people of that.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
all right. There you go. So that these archetypal energies are should be or are intentionally meant to be balanced in both men and women in the relationship of the two, right? And so we've come at this time where we're existentially wiping out, I don't know how many species are being wiped out every year. But it's a very high number where we have to find a way to live together sustainably, not just men and women, but countries, nations, cultures, mythologies, right? Or we're gonna basically go extinct ourselves. I mean, looking at the fact that patriarchal systems, including capitalism, right, including imperialism, all of these isms, right, from the past, what patriarchy, what we can claim 5,000 years maybe for it if we
Like
want to go
five
general,
five
right?
to 6, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, have driven us to the brink where we have a huge discrepancy in the haves and the have-nots, where there's a huge populations of people who are suffering, where we're facing global climate change, that if we get to the higher levels of climate change, such as 3, 4, and 5 degrees, we're talking, I mean, horrific living conditions on the planet.
Right.
And I've said before, we are like COVID to the planet. We're giving the planet a fever. The planet will survive, whether
Mhm.
humanity survives or not. The planet will continue. But the point is,
Yeah.
if we don't find a way to work together in the sense of cooperative living, compassionate living, empathy, support for everyone to be able to live a potentially productive and happy, whatever that means, life, right? Everything's going to fall apart and very quickly. And I think that this is part of the reason for the beginning of the return of the archetypal feminine and why it happened so fast over
Right.
100 years, from 1900 to 2000, right? There's so much change packed in there in terms of reclaiming the idea of the importance of the archetypal feminine and the
So
idea of needing to balance patriarchy. Yeah.
right. So I would like to take that back then to Regency and what role Regency has in that, in what you just described. Is that a response to everything you just described? This
Yeah.
need for the Regency? Because what you're describing is it's not just an archetype, it is an archetype, but there's also something within it in which the archetype can mirror, it sounds like, to women how to live more deeply, what their roles are at this juncture in history, personally, but collectively, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, just thinking about the political power that we have, if we just truncate it to the Census Department predicts there'll be over 87 million women in the US over 50. So imagine what we could do if we worked together in
Right.
making changes to all different kinds of policies, all different kinds of ways of living and national policy looking at restoring some of the things that have been dismantled by the current administration. But politics aside, if women at 45 beginning to go through the perimenopause menopause shift, statistically, these are all broad statistics, right? But statistically, most women have crossed into postmenopause by 51,
Mm.
right? So then if our lifespan is 80, 90 years old, right? We have all these years of regency to decide how we want to interact with culture, with our loved ones, with our friends, with our colleagues, with our communities, and nationally and even internationally, and say how we need to work to make the change that needs to be made, right? And we have women talking about wanting to, build purposeful communities, right? Talk about that a lot.
The
Purposeful,
intentional communities, yeah.
right. Intentional communities to put forth different ways of being in the world, different ways of living, different ways of consuming, right? Looking at certain things in our lives and looking at becoming involved in something, that meaning, purpose, and belonging piece.
Right.
And Jung said midlife is the stage of life whenever it hits you, right? Because sociologists and psychologists can agree that they cannot agree on the bumpers of midlife, when it begins and when it ends, right?
Mhm.
So, Jung said midlife is the time when we are called to abandon the outer world of accomplishment and
Mhm.
dive into the inner world of psyche, soul, and spirit, right?
What if you're ok I might be an outlier, okay? I'm an outlier in most things. So, like, because I don't have kids yet, I might start later on when most people are, like, slowing down.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I don't have kids, but I do, I have had a very yes, I think I was very I have a thread of being very accomplishment oriented, but my spiritual inclinations are very strong since I turned 28. So that happened very early on. And also this desire to be outward focused towards others, even though I don't have, kids. I'm not, it's hard for me, it's hard to see because I won't have that shift from family focus. And I feel like I'm very global focused in a way, like
Yeah. Yeah.
towards the betterment of humanity. So I wonder if if there is also a shift in midlife where it could happen, some of those qualities could happen earlier because there's a whole cohort of women that are choosing not to have families and motherhood.
Yeah, well, I think when we think of the world of accomplishment, right? I think it includes much more than procreation, right? It's
Mm,
more than having children, although though for women who have children and raise, I'm not denigrating it. I have 3 myself, right? I'm just saying that looking there are, and I think this is a function of the anima mundi pushing forth the sacred feminine into culture, right? Is that
mhm,
there are women like yourselves who are coming up in the later generations like millennial, Gen X, Gen Z, right? Who are feeling this call to sacred living, to feminine spirituality, to dismantling the patriarchy, to creating something new and intentional sooner. And I think that's the way it should be happening, right? It shouldn't be
mm.
necessarily that it only happens in menopause, right?
Right,
And I
right.
think that for you or for any woman who goes into that menopause shift and the midlife shift at the same time, how much change you end up going through will depend in some senses on how oriented you are to your deepest ideas of meaning, purpose, and belonging, how early in your life. Does that make
Mhm.
sense? And
Yep.
the shift may be in culture or in your community more than that you engage. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yep,
Does
yep.
that make sense?
It
And
does, yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. I think we're gonna figure it out in the living of it,
Yeah, exactly, in the
right?
next 10
Right? I
years,
don't think
yeah.
anybody can predict these things, but when you just looking at the overall zeitgeist on social media and how many women are really focused and desirous of building something new, something sustainable, and being willing to welcome all men who have the same goals and aspirations, right, to building something sustainable into the fold, that it's not exclusively women only. I mean, some
Right.
groups are, but that the idea is that patriarchy is detrimental to everyone and every
Right.
living being.
Right.
And it's not anyone's fault who is living now that we are living under everybody was born into it, right? It's a system that is so all pervasive and so complete, right? That transforming it is something that is going to take time.
Mm.
It's going to take awareness. And so I really think that the expansion of women's lives into this postmenopause period of incredible opportunity, right? I think about all my matrilineal line of my mother who died at the age of 51 from ovarian cancer. Her mother now lived to be 94, right? But she lived that very conscripted, small life of the housewife who raised children and didn't work and that kind of a thing. And then her mother and her mother before her and her mother before her. And that we have an incredible opportunity that none of our most of our matrilineal line did not have in
Mhm.
terms of the freedoms and the opportunities that we have to go out into the world and and decide to work to affect change in whatever way it is that we decide to do it, right?
Right, right, totally. Yeah, I just really appreciate that you're naming this certain stage in life, that you have committed to the development of this archetype and naming it and describing it and helping women see it. Even though there's that whole sector of, the women's spirit. As I understand it, there are people that are resistant toward this new archetype, really,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
it shouldn't need to be, because it's like you're expanding. You didn't even leave out the crone, like, she still exists in the wise woman archetype.
yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is that I'm not the first person by any means to talk about the human life in four, right? And part of the thing that made it so interesting to me was the idea of two ideas looking at it from an academic point of view, right? Or a research point of view, is that when you look at the Great Round, right, as it was called in, let me see if I can find it in here. Yeah, which was the idea of the Great Mother being one and whole in of herself and represented as the circle, right?
Right.
As the one in herself. And so at 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 the rate of seeming like a real nerd, I just want to show this image because I didn't have a chance to like put it on a slide. But it's for my dissertation, right? The idea of the great round, we see this here, right?
Is
And
that
the
what
idea, this is actually a serpent adapted drawing by Theodore Pellicano from 1478,
Sweet.
right? So the idea of the great round of the great mother as being the circle. And so here you can see that it's divided into four already by time and space, right? That time, goes horizontal, right? And it might be showing backwards because sometimes it reverses it on.
No, it's I can see space at the top, time is to the right.
Yeah, yeah. So it's space and time. So in a sense, the time is past to present, and space is where we are living our embodied life, right? Where
Mhm.
where the axis mundi, that center point that we each have our own walking stick, if you will, that we plant and we say, this is my center, this is who I am, this is what I am. And so that's where you live your embodied aspect in time and in space on the timeline, right? And so
Yeah.
already from the very beginning, looking at living in the dimensions, the three dimensions that we live in, the the early ideas of are there very early, even through the work of Pythagoras and different writers and different philosophers. I just want to read a couple paragraphs from the research part of the dissertation on the idea of four. We've already talked about the Great Round and it being split into four by time and space, right? And so it says, I wrote, the identification of four stages of development in human life is not a new idea. In ancient Greece, the number 4 was known as a metaphor for the natural order and the human psyche. Pythagoras and his followers believed that tetractys, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, a geometric representation of the numbers 1 through 4, held the secrets of the natural world, and this figure represented the development of the world from a singularity to a line, then a plane, and finally to the third dimension of breadth and depth. And that's from Edinger, his work
Mhm.
called The Psyche. In Volume 2, The Psychology and Religion of the Collected Works, Jung suggests Pythagoras' idea in reference to his concept of the quaternity as the model for the psyche. Jung asserts that the quaternity, or in 4, right, is the archetype of almost universal occurrence. He goes on to claim that the concept of defining life, consciousness, or spiritual principles as being contained within a trinity model is an incomplete artificial construct. He argues that 4 is archetypal in nature and in humanity. There are 4 elements, 4 prime qualities, 4 colors. So too, there are 4 aspects of psychological orientation, these being the 4 functions of sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. The idea of the completeness is the circle or the sphere, but its natural minimum division is a quaternion. Edinger suggests that Pythagoras' 4 geometric models within the tetractys can also represent human psychological development in infancy. The single point, the center, which Jung called the self, is the beginning or the center of the psyche. The second point references the birth of will and pursuant movement. The third is the construction of mental images. And the fourth is the unification of the center with will and image in order to create ego and engage in the world. And Jung also divides the stage of life into 4: childhood, youth, middle age, and old age, right? He says the 180 degrees of life are divisible into 4 parts. And he goes on to talk about that. So looking at the development of women's expression of their own archetypal divinity through images of the goddess, right? Through ideas of the goddess, to me, it makes perfect sense when you look at the idea of the round, time and space, and that as humanity evolved and as our lifespan evolved, right, that it necessitated the addition of an additional life stage because, for it to go from the unity to the duality to the trinity and then have crone be 20, 30, 40 years long, it doesn't reflect, right, women's lived reality, which is the entirely new life stage
Right.
that and most 50-year-old women are feeling like they're on top of their game, right? They
Right.
all of their wisdom, their career, their career knowledge, right? All of their lived experience.
Right.
And most feel like they're ready to go on and really do their opus at 50.
Right.
I mean, you
Right.
can look at Forbes magazine has a huge article every year, a huge research project or presentation they do every year, which is the Forbes 50 over, which is
Mm.
women over 50 who are doing amazing things in everything from the arts to the sciences to politics, around the world, right? And
Wow.
so the emergence of the desire and the quest for the rebalancing of the masculine and the feminine in the human psyche and in the way we interact with and work within the world, live within the world, right? Along with the lengthening of our lifespan, along with the fact that we go through a triple transformation in our
Mhm.
embodied experience that is very difficult, very different from what men experience.
Right.
I really felt it was very obvious to me that
Right.
there's a new stage of life that's emerged for women. Now, other women have talked about this, other mythologists or spiritual teachers. Donna Hennis in the 70s, I think, called it the Queen Age, right?
Mhm.
Teenagers, right? And it's cute, Queenagers is kind of a cute name, but to me, I don't know, I really had a hard time with the idea of queen because to me that queen implies royalty, which to me implies wealth, that that you have all sorts of resources, that queens have all kinds of people working for them, that they have either servants or they have, staff, right? And that a queen does not struggle. A queen lives in a particular way of being, right? And I don't think most women at 50 feel that way at all.
Right.
So when I was searching for a term, I decided to use regent because a regent is someone who, it's also a term having to do with lineage and royalty. A regent is someone who takes over the rule of a nation or a kingdom until the young person, male or female, who is underage, grows up and has been educated enough to actually rule. And then the regent hands the rule over to the prince or princess or king or queen or whoever.
Mhm.
And so to me, a regent is someone who can make decisions, who can rule their own life, I have a whole regent's manifesto, right? Who can embody her potential, who decides what she's going to do, how she'll do it, how she wants to pursue her own authentic and fulfilled life, is dynamic and active, and that the regent actually holds the throne for her wise woman to come.
I think that's a really great place to wrap this up is with the Regent Manifesto. So, any last words before we say goodbye?
No, I don't know if we got in the weeds a little bit there academically for most people, but the idea to me is that going from 3 to 4 does not exclude anything. It expands and implies more power, more options, more divinity, more action, more divine potential
Yeah.
within women to fulfill that, to have that extra 30 years to become their most authentic and fulfilled self, whatever that is.
Yeah. Totally. Well, thank you, Andre. I'm glad that we did this and people could get like a real sense of like the foundation for your work and why you're doing what you're doing and also the scholarship behind it, the in-depth kind of soul work that you've done. So it's not just this fancy idea for women, but it has like real depth to it and purpose and structure. So
Yeah.
to
And
everybody, oh, go ahead.
we'll put the link to the dissertation in the show notes, and if anybody's really interested, I mean, you can flip through the table of contents and you can go and pick and choose what you wanna read. You don't have to read all the arguments, you know? So
Totally. Totally. Yeah, totally. So, everybody, thank you so much for being here today. And like I said at the top, please like, please share, please comment, please subscribe to the channel and join us next week. We're still securing that guest, but we have some other interesting guests on fun conversations scheduled for July, including a return of Dr. Joanna Kuyawa. I don't know exactly what she's going to be talking about, but something related to the Alien Goddess book. So,
awesome.
yeah. So, to everybody at home, thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, bye-bye.